"We don't serve drifters who can't pay," the banker said loud enough for everyone in town to hear. The room laughed. Not because the joke was funny, because nobody expected the quiet cowboy by the door to answer back. He didn't. He simply lowered his eyes, turned toward the street, and stepped into the cold Wyoming wind. What nobody knew was that before the week was over, that same cowboy would walk into a nearly forgotten diner, hear 6 simple words, and find something he had not possessed in 11 years. A reason to stay. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from. Somewhere beyond those dusty roads, beyond the cattle trails and lonely plains, there might still be a place that feels like home. Elias Walker had almost forgotten what that word meant. The afternoon sun hung low over Dry Creek, casting long shadows across the wooden storefronts. Dust drifted through the main street like smoke from an old memory. Elias moved slowly beneath the boardwalk awnings, his boots worn thin after hundreds of miles on horseback. His hat hid most of his face, but not the exhaustion. That kind of exhaustion could not be hidden. It settled into a man's shoulders, into the way he walked, into the silence he carried everywhere he went. Most people in Dry Creek knew only 2 things about him. He was alone, and he never stayed anywhere for long. The laughter from the bank still echoed behind him. He had enough money for a meal, just not enough to impress anyone. Out here, poverty was often treated like a character flaw. A man without land, family, or status became invisible. Elias had learned that years ago. The strange thing was, he no longer felt angry when people dismissed him. Anger required energy, and he had spent most of his long ago. He crossed the street and reached the edge of town where fewer people walked. A faded wooden sign creaked above a narrow building. Hill's Diner. The paint had peeled so badly that several letters were barely visible. One window was cracked. Another had been patched with cardboard. It looked like the sort of place people forgot existed. Yet a thin ribbon of smoke curled from the chimney. Someone was still keeping the fire alive. Elias hesitated. Through the glass, he could see only 3 occupied tables. A pair of ranch hands near the window, an elderly farmer drinking coffee alone, and a woman behind the counter wiping the same clean plate over and over again. She looked to be in her early 40s. Dark brown hair tied neatly behind her head. Simple dress. Tired eyes. Not defeated eyes. Just tired. There was a difference. He pushed open the door. A small bell chimed overhead. The smell hit him immediately. Fresh bread. Chicken broth. Coffee. Warmth. For a moment, he simply stood there. The room felt strangely distant, as if he were remembering it instead of entering it. The woman looked up first. Their eyes met briefly. She offered a polite smile. Nothing dramatic. Nothing extraordinary. Yet it felt different from the expressions he usually received. She wasn't measuring him. Wasn't calculating what he owned. Wasn't deciding whether he belonged. She simply nodded toward an empty table. Sit wherever you'd like. Her voice carried the calm confidence of someone who had learned how to survive disappointment without becoming bitter. Elias chose a seat near the wall. Old habits. He liked seeing the door. The woman approached with a coffee pot. Coffee. He nodded. She filled the cup. Steam curled into the air. For a few moments, neither spoke. Outside, wind rattled against the windows. Somewhere in the kitchen, a spoon tapped gently against a metal pot. The diner felt suspended in time, safe from the rest of the world. The woman finally glanced toward him. Passing through, Elias looked down at the coffee. Most likely. She nodded as if she understood that answer better than most people would. Then she noticed something. The hesitation before he lifted the cup. The way his eyes briefly drifted toward the menu but never settled. The small details people usually missed. She set the coffee pot down. Have you eaten? The question landed harder than any insult he had heard all week. Elias froze. His hand stopped halfway to the cup. The sounds of the diner faded. 11 years disappeared in an instant. A different table. A different voice. A different life. The memory struck so suddenly he almost forgot where he was. Because the last person who had asked him that question had been his wife. 11 years ago. Before illness. Before loss. Before the long road that followed. Before the loneliness became normal. He stared at the woman standing beside the table. She had no way of knowing what those 4 words meant. Yet somehow she had reached a place inside him that nobody had touched in years. The widow tilted her head slightly. You all right? Elias swallowed. Slowly. Carefully. Then he answered with the truth. Not yet. Something changed in her expression. Not pity. Not sympathy. Recognition. as if she understood that answer better than he realized. She smiled gently. Then let me fix that. And as Margaret Hale disappeared into the kitchen, carrying nothing but a simple order for soup, neither of them noticed the empty chair waiting quietly in the corner of the diner. The chair no customer ever used. The chair already holding a secret that would change both their lives. Margaret Hale stood over the stove while the soup simmered gently beneath a cast iron lid darkened by years of use. The diner was quiet again. Quiet enough to hear the clock ticking above the shelves. Quiet enough to hear the wind pushing dust against the windows. Most days, that silence felt heavier than the building itself. She ladled broth into a bowl and glanced toward the man sitting alone near the wall. Elias Walker had not moved much since she left the table. His hands remained wrapped around the coffee cup. His eyes seemed fixed somewhere far beyond the room. Margaret recognized that look. She had seen it in mirrors for more than a decade. The look of someone carrying conversations with ghosts. She placed fresh bread beside the soup and carried both across the room. The aroma filled the air between them. Chicken, carrots, onions, herbs. Nothing special. Just honest food made carefully. She set the bowl down without ceremony. Elias looked at it for several seconds before speaking. How much? Margaret shook her head. First bowl is on the house. Elias frowned slightly. Why? The question surprised her. Not because he asked it. Because he sounded genuinely confused. As if kindness required an explanation. Margaret folded a towel across her arm. Because a hungry man should eat. For a moment neither spoke. Then she returned behind the counter. Elias stared at the steam rising from the bowl. The scent unlocked memories he had spent years trying not to touch. Sunday afternoons. Small kitchens. Family conversations. The sound of laughter. He reached for the spoon. The first bite nearly stopped him. Not because it was extraordinary. Because it tasted familiar. Familiarity was dangerous. Familiarity reminded a man of what he had lost. Across the room, Margaret pretended to organize receipts while secretly watching him. Most customers talked, complained, asked questions, filled silence with noise. Elias did none of those things. Yet somehow his quiet presence changed the atmosphere of the diner. The elderly farmer near the window eventually paid his bill and left. The ranch hands finished their coffee and followed. Soon only Elias remained. Afternoon sunlight stretched across the wooden floorboards. Dust floated through golden beams near the windows. The room felt suspended between one day and the next. Elias finished the last spoonful and sat quietly. Then something caught his attention. The chair in the corner. He had noticed it earlier, but now he looked closer. Unlike every other chair in the diner, this one appeared untouched. Clean. Polished. A folded napkin rested beside a plate. A coffee cup sat waiting. Fresh. As if someone expected company. Every day? His eyes narrowed slightly. Strange. No customer had approached it. No customer had even glanced at it. Yet someone clearly maintained it. Margaret noticed where he was looking. Her hand stopped moving for just a moment. A brief pause. Almost invisible. Then she resumed wiping the counter. Elias considered asking about it. Instead, he remained silent. Years of traveling had taught him something valuable. Every lonely place contained a story. Most stories revealed themselves only when they were ready. The bell above the door chimed suddenly. A man entered wearing an expensive coat that seemed out of place in Dry Creek. His boots were polished. His watch chain gleamed beneath the afternoon light. He looked around with the confidence of someone accustomed to owning things. His gaze landed immediately on Margaret. Afternoon, Mrs. Hale. Her expression cooled slightly. Mr. Whitaker. Elias noticed the change instantly. Margaret rarely revealed emotion. Yet something about this visitor tightened her shoulders. The man approached the counter. Business looks slow. Margaret folded another towel. Business survives. The man smiled, but warmth never reached his eyes. Not for long. The words hung in the air. Elias lowered his gaze toward the table, but listened carefully. Whitaker leaned closer. You have until the end of the month. After that, the property transfers. Margaret remained calm. I know the date. Good. He glanced around the nearly empty diner. Would be ashamed to lose this place. Then he added quietly, though some would say it already died years ago. The comment lingered. Disrespect wrapped inside politeness. Margaret's face remained composed, but her fingers tightened around the towel. Whitaker tipped his hat and left. The door closed behind him. Silence returned. Yet it felt different now. Heavier. Elias looked toward Margaret. Bank. She nodded once. Something like that. Neither said more. But a seed of curiosity had been planted. After a few minutes, Margaret carried another cup of coffee to his table. You did not have to listen. Elias looked out the window. Hard not to. She almost smiled. Almost. Then she glanced toward the empty chair again. Her expression softened in a way Elias had not seen before. Not sadness. Not exactly. Memory. He followed her gaze. Someone used to sit there. Margaret stared at the chair for several long seconds. Every day. Her voice grew quieter. For 18 years. Elias waited. She said nothing else. The silence that followed carried more weight than any explanation. The clock ticked. Outside, a wagon rolled slowly down Main Street. Somewhere beyond the diner walls, life continued. Yet inside, both of them remained fixed on that empty chair. Then Elias noticed something else. Beneath the neatly folded napkin rested the corner of an old envelope. Yellowed with age. Carefully preserved. A name was visible on the front, partially hidden beneath the plate. He could only read a few letters before Margaret gently moved the napkin into place. The motion seemed automatic. Protective. Almost sacred. Whatever story belonged to that chair was still unfinished. And for reasons he could not explain, Elias suddenly wanted to know how it ended. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale gray clouds that drifted low across the Wyoming sky. Elias Walker had intended to leave before sunrise. That had been the plan. It was always the plan. Arrive. Rest. Move on. Never stay long enough for roots to find him. Yet when dawn painted the horizon silver and gold, he found himself sitting outside Hale's diner with a cup of coffee warming his hands. Across the street, merchants unlocked their stores. Wagons rolled over packed dirt roads. Somewhere nearby, a blacksmith's hammer rang against steel. Dry Creek was waking up. Margaret arrived carrying a small basket of vegetables from the market. She stopped when she saw him. I thought you would be halfway to Montana by now. Elias looked toward the distant hills. Thought so too. A faint smile touched her lips before she stepped inside. That smile stayed with him longer than it should have. Throughout the morning, customers drifted in and out. Farmers, travelers, railroad workers. Margaret greeted every one of them with patience that seemed almost impossible. Yet Elias noticed something. Most people barely looked at her. They ordered food, paid their bills, left. Few asked how she was doing. Fewer still noticed how tired she looked. It reminded him of the way people treated old buildings. They stopped seeing them after a while. Around noon, Elias helped carry a broken crate from the storeroom without being asked. Margaret raised an eyebrow. You work for soup now? Seems like a fair trade. You drive a hard bargain, Cowboy. For the first time, he almost laughed. Almost. Hours passed. The diner remained slow. Too slow. By late afternoon, Margaret sat behind the counter reviewing a stack of papers. Her expression grew more troubled with each page. Elias pretended not to notice. Then the door opened again. Mr. Whitaker returned. This time he carried a leather folder beneath his arm. His polished boots clicked against the floorboards. Mrs. Hale. Margaret closed the papers immediately. Mr. Whitaker. He glanced around the nearly empty room. Business still struggling, I see. Elias felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. Whitaker placed the folder on the counter. I brought another offer. Margaret did not touch it. My answer has not changed. You should reconsider. His voice remained polite. Too polite. The kind of politeness that concealed pressure. There is no reason to fight the inevitable. Margaret stared directly at him. This diner is not for sale. Whitaker sighed dramatically. Sentiment is expensive, especially these days. His eyes drifted toward the empty chair in the corner. Something flickered across his face. Recognition. Then amusement. You still keep that chair set every day? Margaret's jaw tightened. Leave it alone. Whitaker chuckled softly. 12 years later, and you are still waiting. Silence filled the room. Even the clock seemed to stop ticking. Elias watched Margaret carefully. Her eyes remained fixed on the counter. Not angry. Not embarrassed. Hurt. Whitaker realized he had crossed a line. Yet instead of apologizing, he merely adjusted his coat. You have 3 weeks. Then he walked out. The door closed behind him. Margaret stood perfectly still for several seconds. Finally, she picked up the folder and shoved it beneath the counter. Elias returned a coffee cup to its saucer. The small sound seemed unusually loud. You do not have to explain. Margaret stared toward the window. Good. Because I do not think I could. Outside, Rain began falling softly. Tiny drops tapped against the glass. One customer entered. Then another. Evening settled over Dry Creek. Lamps glowed along Main Street. The diner slowly emptied again until only 2 people remained. Margaret wiped tables while Elias stacked chairs. Neither spoke much. Somehow the silence no longer felt uncomfortable. At one point he glanced toward the mysterious chair again. Fresh coffee still sat there. Untouched. Waiting. Always waiting. As darkness deepened beyond the windows, Margaret locked the front door. "You staying in town tonight?" she asked. Elias nodded. "Probably. There is a boarding house 2 blocks over." "I know." She hesitated. "Good." Yet something about her expression suggested she wanted to say more. Instead, she extinguished one of the lanterns. Shadows stretched across the room. Elias moved toward the door. Then he paused. "Margaret." She looked up. "Yes." He searched for the right words. They refused to come. Finally, he settled on the truth. "That soup yesterday was the best meal I have had in years." For a moment, she simply stared at him. Then her tired eyes softened. "Come back tomorrow. I will make more." Elias nodded once and stepped into the cool evening air. Neither of them noticed that the old envelope beneath the plate on the empty chair had shifted slightly. Just enough for another letter of the name to become visible. Just enough to hint that the story buried inside that chair was connected to something much larger than either of them realized. And if you have made it this far into the story, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. And leave a like, because the secret hidden inside that old envelope is about to change everything. The rain continued through the night. By morning, Dry Creek smelled of wet earth, wood smoke, and fresh coffee drifting from Hale's diner. Elias arrived earlier than usual. The streets were nearly empty. A delivery wagon rattled somewhere beyond the fog, and a stray dog slept beneath the general store porch. When he pushed open the diner door, the familiar bell chimed softly overhead. Margaret was already inside. She stood near the front window balancing accounts with a pencil tucked behind one ear. For a moment, she did not notice him. The worry on her face seemed deeper than yesterday. Numbers covered several pages spread across the counter. Numbers she erased and rewrote again and again as if determination alone could change them. Then she looked up. "You came back." Elias removed his hat. "You said there would be soup." That earned a genuine smile. Small. Brief. Real. Fair point. The morning passed quietly. Customers arrived in waves. A ranch hand with a broken wagon wheel. A schoolteacher grading papers. 2 travelers heading east toward Cheyenne. Elias found himself staying longer than intended. First, he helped unload sacks of flour. Then he repaired a loose cabinet hinge in the kitchen. Then he fixed a chair leg that had wobbled for months. Margaret noticed everything. She simply pretended not to. Around noon, while replacing supplies on a shelf, Elias heard voices outside. The front door opened. 2 women entered carrying baskets. They greeted Margaret warmly before lowering their voices. "Not low enough." "Did you hear?" one asked. "Whitaker already bought the old feed store." Margaret nodded without enthusiasm. "I heard. People say he plans to own half the town before winter." The second woman glanced around the diner. Her eyes briefly landed on Elias. "And they say he wants this place most of all." Margaret continued arranging cups. "People say many things." Yet after the women left, the silence returned heavier than before. Later that afternoon, Elias stepped into the storeroom searching for extra firewood. The room smelled of flour, cedar, and old paper. Shelves lined the walls. Boxes filled corners. Near the back stood a narrow desk buried beneath receipts and invoices. He placed a stack of wood beside the stove and turned to leave. Then he noticed something. A framed photograph partially hidden behind several ledgers. Curiosity made him pause. The image showed a younger Margaret standing beside a tall man wearing a work apron. Both smiled at the camera. Between them stood the very same diner. Fresh paint. Bright windows. Crowded tables visible through the glass. A thriving business. A thriving life. Elias studied the man's face. There was something steady about him. Familiar somehow. Before he could look longer, Margaret appeared in the doorway. Neither spoke immediately. She glanced toward the photograph. That was 12 years ago. Elias carefully returned it to its place. "Your husband?" She nodded. "Thomas Hale." The name lingered in the room. Thomas Hale. Elias felt a strange tug somewhere in his memory. Nothing clear. Just a faint sensation. Like hearing distant music through a wall. Margaret stepped closer and gently dusted the frame. He built most of this place himself. Her voice softened. Worked 6 days a week. Sometimes 7. Looks proud. He was. A faint smile appeared, then faded. People used to line up outside the door every Saturday. Elias glanced around the storeroom. What happened? The question escaped before he could stop it. Margaret looked down. For several seconds, she seemed to consider whether to answer. Life happened. She turned away and returned to the kitchen. Yet something about her expression suggested there was far more to the story. That evening the diner closed early. Rain clouds gathered again across the horizon. Elias helped stack chairs while Margaret counted the register. The total was disappointing. He could tell by her face. Not enough customers. Not enough money. Not enough time. As he carried the final chair toward the corner, he stopped beside the mysterious empty seat. For the first time, he stood close enough to examine it properly. The coffee cup sat perfectly centered. The plate remained spotless. The folded napkin looked newly pressed. Everything appeared untouched by time. Then he noticed the envelope again, a little more visible than before. The edge had slipped beneath the plate, just enough to reveal several letters written in faded ink. E.W. His breath caught. Only for an instant. Perhaps coincidence. Perhaps nothing at all. Yet something about those initials stirred an old memory. Margaret suddenly appeared beside him. Neither spoke. Her eyes followed his gaze toward the envelope. You ever wait for someone? She asked quietly. Elias stared at the chair. Long time ago. Did they come back? He thought about the question. Thought about roads traveled. Graves visited. Promises broken by time. No. Margaret nodded slowly as if she already knew the answer. Then she adjusted the plate, covering the initials once more. Sometimes people leave things behind, she said. And those things stay longer than they do. Elias looked at her. Like letters? Like debts. The word hung in the air. Debts. Not money. Something deeper. Something older. Outside, thunder rolled across distant hills. Inside, neither moved. And for the first time since arriving in Dry Creek, Elias began to suspect that the secret hidden inside that envelope might somehow be connected to him. The following morning arrived bright and cold after the storm. Sunlight spilled across Main Street, turning puddles into patches of silver. Elias woke before dawn in the small boarding house at the edge of town, yet instead of preparing his horse for another journey, he found himself staring through the window toward the distant chimney of Hale's diner. The realization annoyed him more than he cared to admit. He had stayed 3 days. 3 days became 4. 4 became 5. Men like him were not supposed to stay anywhere. Yet every road he imagined taking somehow led back to that little building with the cracked window and the woman who always seemed to know when someone needed a warm meal more than they needed questions. By 7 o'clock, he was walking through the diner door. Margaret looked up from the counter and shook her head. You are becoming predictable. Elias removed his hat. That sounds serious. For a drifter, it is. He almost smiled. Almost. The morning crowd came and went. Elias repaired a loose section of fence behind the diner. Then he fixed a leaking water barrel. Then he helped unload a wagon of potatoes from a supplier who complained about everything except the weather. The strange part was that nobody had asked him to do any of it. Around noon, Margaret placed a fresh bowl of soup in front of him. You know I cannot keep paying you in meals forever. Elias glanced at the bowl. Looks like you are trying. Margaret laughed softly. The sound surprised both of them. It had been a long time since laughter stayed in the room after it arrived. Later that afternoon, the diner became unusually quiet. Only a handful of customers occupied the tables. Outside, a freight wagon rolled past carrying lumber toward the railroad depot. Inside, sunlight drifted lazily across the floorboards. Margaret disappeared into the storeroom to organize supplies. Elias remained near the counter drinking coffee. Then he heard something fall. Not loudly, just enough. He stood and walked. Toward the back, Margaret was kneeling beside a shelf. Several old boxes had slipped onto the floor. Papers were scattered everywhere. You all right? He asked. Fine. She did not sound fine. Elias crouched to help gather the papers. Most were receipts. Old invoices. Utility bills. Then he noticed one folded document unlike the others. Yellowed with age. The corner bore the same handwriting he had glimpsed on the envelope beneath the plate. Before he could read anything, Margaret gently took it from his hand. Her expression changed immediately. Not anger. Fear. Real fear. Sorry, Elias said quietly. Margaret looked at the document for several seconds. Then she sat down on an overturned crate. The storeroom suddenly felt smaller. Dust floated through beams of sunlight near the ceiling. Somewhere beyond the wall, the old clock continued ticking. Finally she spoke. Thomas wrote this 3 weeks before he died. Elias remained silent. Some stories required space. I have never been able to throw it away. Her fingers moved carefully across the folded paper. He believed every problem could be solved if you worked hard enough. A sad smile appeared. Turns out life disagreed. Elias looked toward the shelves. You miss him? Margaret laughed quietly. Not because anything was funny. Because some truths were too obvious. Every day, the answers settled into the room. Honest. Simple. Heavy. After a long pause, she continued. People think grief gets smaller with time. She shook her head. It does not. You just learn how to carry it better. Elias lowered his gaze. Those words reached places he rarely allowed anyone near. That sounds about right. Margaret studied him carefully. Who was she? The question caught him completely off guard. For several seconds, neither moved. Then he understood. She had seen it. The same loneliness. The same absence. Elias stared at the floorboards. Her name was Anna. Saying the name aloud felt strange. Like opening a door sealed shut years ago. She used to make soup every Sunday. Margaret smiled softly. That explains a lot. Elias looked up. What does? The way you looked at the first bowl. For a moment, the years between them disappeared. 2 lonely people sitting in a dusty storeroom surrounded by old papers and unfinished memories. Then a sudden gust of wind rattled the back door. Both turned instinctively. One of the boxes had shifted again. This time a small leather journal slid from the shelf and landed on the floor. The cover had faded with age. Margaret stared at it. Her expression immediately changed. Elias noticed. What is it? She slowly picked up the journal. I have not seen this in years. Her voice had grown quieter, more cautious. She opened the cover. A folded letter slipped out and landed at her feet. The paper unfolded slightly as it fell. Elias could not see the entire page. Only a few lines near the bottom. But one detail immediately caught his attention. A signature. The handwriting looked identical to the name hidden beneath the plate in the empty chair. Margaret's face lost all color. She stared at the letter as though she had just seen a ghost. Then she whispered 5 words that made Elias forget everything else. This should not be here. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. The letter rested on the floor between them like something that had been waiting years to be found. Outside, a wagon rolled past the diner. Somewhere in town, a church bell rang once. Yet inside the storeroom, time seemed to slow. Margaret bent down carefully and picked up the paper with trembling fingers. Elias had never seen her hands shake before. Not when Whitaker threatened her business. Not when bills piled higher each month. Not even when speaking about Thomas. But now, looking at a single sheet of yellowed paper, she seemed genuinely unsettled. What is it? Elias asked quietly. Margaret stared at the folded letter. I do not know. The answer sounded strange even to her. She unfolded the page slowly. Dust drifted through the narrow beams of sunlight overhead. The old paper crackled softly. Her eyes moved across the words, then stopped. Elias watched her expression change. Surprise first, then confusion, then something deeper. Recognition. She lowered herself onto the crate again. Margaret. She swallowed hard. This letter was never supposed to be delivered. Elias frowned. What do you mean? For a moment, she simply stared at the handwriting. Thomas wrote this during his final winter. Her voice had grown distant. He told me there were 3 letters. One for me, one for the bank, and one for someone he never named. Elias remained silent. I found the first 2 after he passed away. She glanced toward the paper. I never found the third. The words settled heavily between them. For 12 years, she had believed it was gone. Lost. Destroyed. Yet somehow it had been sitting inside the diner all along. Hidden inside an old journal nobody had opened in years. Margaret read several lines again. Then she looked up at Elias. This is strange. What is? She hesitated. The person he wrote to. Her voice trailed away. Elias waited. The initials are EW. The room became very quiet. Elias felt a small chill move through his chest. EW. The same initials he had glimpsed beneath the plate. The same initials that matched his own name. Coincidences existed. The frontier was full of them. Yet something about this felt different. Margaret seemed to sense it too. There are probably hundreds of people with those initials. Elias nodded. Probably. Neither sounded convinced. She folded the letter again. I should not jump to conclusions. No. Yet both of them were already thinking the same thing. The afternoon passed in an uneasy silence. Margaret returned to work, but her focus drifted. She misplaced orders, forgot ingredients, counted the same receipt twice. Customers noticed. Elias noticed more. Every few minutes her eyes wandered toward the storeroom where the letter now rested inside her apron pocket. By evening, the diner had emptied once again. The sky outside burned orange and crimson above the western hills. Long shadows stretched across Main Street. Elias remained at his usual table. Margaret stood near the empty chair. She was holding the old envelope again, studying it, comparing the handwriting, looking from one letter to the other. Finally, she approached him. Can I ask you something? Elias set down his coffee cup. Sure. Where were you born? The question caught him off guard. Colorado. Always lived there. Not exactly. Margaret sat across from him. Did your father ever know a man named Thomas Hale? Elias stared at her. A strange sensation tightened inside him. Memory. Half forgotten. Incomplete. He leaned back slowly. I do not know. Margaret blinked. You do not know? Elias looked toward the window. My father rarely talked about his past. That was true. His father had spoken little about the years before Colorado, about the towns he visited, the people he met, the favors he owed. Did he ever mention Wyoming? Margaret asked. Elias thought carefully. Then something surfaced. A memory no bigger than a spark. A winter evening. A fireplace. His father polishing a saddle. A name spoken once and never again. Hale. Elias sat upright. Margaret immediately noticed. What is it? Maybe nothing. Tell me. He rubbed a hand across his jaw. When I was a boy, my father used to talk about a man who helped him during a terrible snow season. Margaret did not move. What man? Elias searched his memory. The details were old, worn by time. I only remember one thing clearly. His voice lowered. The man's last name was Hale. Neither spoke. Outside, darkness slowly settled across Dry Creek. The lamps inside the diner flickered softly. The old clock continued ticking above the shelves. Margaret stared at him. Elias stared back. Somewhere between them sat a mystery neither fully understood. Then Margaret whispered something that neither had considered before. What if Thomas knew your father? Elias looked toward the empty chair, toward the envelope, toward the secrets that suddenly felt much closer than before. For the first time since arriving in Dry Creek, he no longer believed his presence in the diner was an accident. And somewhere deep inside, a feeling he had ignored for years began to stir. Not hope, not yet, but something close enough to make him stay one more day. Thank you for spending this time with this story and staying with Elias and Margaret this far down the road. The question lingered between them long after the diner closed for the night. What if Thomas Hale had known Elias's father? What if the letter hidden for 12 years had been written for someone connected to the man now sitting across from Margaret? Neither of them had answers, yet neither could stop thinking about it. Elias barely slept. The boarding house mattress creaked every time he turned over. Outside, coyotes called somewhere beyond the hills. He stared at the ceiling and replayed fragments of memory. His father sitting beside a stove during winter. His father speaking rarely about the past. His father mentioning a man named Hale exactly once. Just once. Yet now that memory refused to leave him alone. Morning arrived with a sharp wind blowing across Dry Creek. The sky was clear, but the air carried the first warning of an early autumn. Elias arrived at the diner before sunrise. To his surprise, Margaret was already there. A lantern glowed behind the front window. He stepped inside. The smell of fresh bread filled the room. Margaret stood beside the counter holding the old letter. She looked as though she had not slept either. You have been reading it all night, Elias said. She glanced up. Most of it. And Margaret hesitated. It still does not make sense. She carefully unfolded the paper. Thomas never mentions a first name. Only initials. Elias pulled out a chair. What does it say? Margaret looked down at the faded handwriting. For a moment, she seemed uncertain whether to continue. Then she began reading aloud. The words were simple, honest, written by a man who knew time was precious. Thomas spoke about gratitude, about promises, about debts that could never truly be repaid. Several passages referred to an event during a brutal winter many years earlier. A winter when another man had saved his life during a snowstorm in the mountains. Elias listened carefully. Every detail pulled him deeper into the mystery. Then Margaret reached a sentence that made both of them freeze. If this letter ever finds E.W., tell him his father was the finest man I ever knew. Silence settled over the diner. Even the wind outside seemed to disappear. Elias stared at the letter. His pulse quickened. Margaret slowly lowered the page. E.W. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Elias shook his head. There could be another E.W. There could. Yet neither sounded convinced. The bell above the door suddenly rang. Both turned. An elderly man entered carrying a sack of grain over one shoulder. He removed his hat and smiled. "Morning, Margaret." "Morning, Mr. Cooper." Elias recognized him as one of the oldest ranchers in the county. Cooper had lived near Dry Creek longer than anyone else. The old rancher settled into a chair and ordered coffee. Margaret served him while Elias remained silent. Then an idea occurred to him. "Mr. Cooper," he said. The old man looked up. "Yes." Elias exchanged a glance with Margaret. "Did you know Thomas Hale?" Cooper laughed softly. Everybody knew Thomas. "Did he ever talk about Colorado?" The old rancher frowned. "Sometimes." Elias leaned forward slightly. "Did he ever mention a man named Walker?" Cooper's expression changed immediately. Not dramatically, just enough. A tiny shift. A flicker of recognition. Margaret noticed it too. "Walker," Cooper repeated. "That takes me back." The diner suddenly felt very small. "You remember?" Margaret asked. Cooper nodded slowly. "Of course I do." He took a careful sip of coffee. "Thomas and a fellow named Samuel Walker worked together one winter after a railroad accident stranded half the county." Elias felt his chest tighten. Samuel Walker. His father. Cooper continued. "Those two were inseparable for months." Margaret stared at Elias. Elias stared at Cooper. The old rancher seemed surprised by their reaction. "Why?" Margaret asked quietly. Cooper shrugged. "Thomas always said he owed Samuel more than he could repay." The word struck like thunder. Owed Samuel more than he could repay. Debt. The same word Thomas had written. The same word Margaret had repeated. The same word hidden inside 12 years of silence. Cooper eventually finished his coffee and left, unaware that he had just changed everything. After the door closed, neither Margaret nor Elias moved. The mystery was no longer a coincidence. It was real. Thomas had known Samuel Walker. Thomas had written a letter to E.W. Thomas, had left an empty chair waiting for 12 years. Margaret looked toward that chair now. The morning sunlight touched its polished wood. The untouched cup sat exactly where it always had, waiting. Then a thought crossed her mind. A thought so unexpected she almost refused to say it aloud. But eventually she did. "Elias." He looked up. "What?" Margaret's voice barely rose above a whisper. "What if that chair was never waiting for Thomas?" Elias frowned. "What do you mean?" She looked from the letter to the envelope and back again. Her eyes filled with sudden understanding. "What if it was waiting for you?" The words settled over the diner like dust after a long journey. Elias looked at the empty chair, then at Margaret, then back at the chair again. The idea sounded impossible. Yet so had everything else that had happened since he stepped through the front door days earlier. "That does not make any sense," he said quietly. Margaret folded her arms. "I know. Thomas could not have known me. No. He could not have known I would walk into this diner. No." They sat in silence. The old clock ticked steadily above the shelves. Outside, Dry Creek continued with its ordinary day. Horses crossed Main Street. Wagons rattled over packed dirt. Somewhere a child laughed. Yet inside the diner, nothing felt ordinary anymore. Margaret picked up the letter once more. "Maybe we are looking at this the wrong way." Elias leaned forward. "How?" She tapped a finger against the paper. Thomas was not the kind of man who waited for specific people. He believed in promises. Elias listened. Maybe the chair was never reserved for one person. She glanced toward the window. Maybe it was reserved for a debt. The word returned again. Debt. It seemed to appear everywhere now. In the letter. In old conversations. In forgotten memories. Elias stood and walked toward the chair. For the first time, he pulled it away from the table. The legs scraped softly across the floorboards. Margaret watched carefully. Beneath the seat, carved into the wood where nobody would normally look, were two small initials. Th. Thomas Hale. Elias ran his fingers across them. The carving was old. Years old. "He made this himself," Margaret said softly. Elias nodded. Then something else caught his eye. A tiny metal latch beneath the seat. Hidden. Nearly invisible. He frowned. Margaret. She walked over. What? Elias pointed. Her eyes widened. I have never seen that before. He carefully released the latch. A small compartment opened inside the chair. Both of them froze. Inside rested a folded photograph and a rusted brass key. Nothing more. Nothing less. Margaret slowly removed the photograph. The edges were worn. The image faded. Yet the faces remained clear enough to recognize. Thomas Hale stood on one side. Beside him stood a younger Samuel Walker. Both men smiled at the camera. Snow covered the ground around them. A wooden cabin stood in the background. Margaret stared at the photograph. Elias could barely breathe. His father looked exactly as he remembered. Strong, calm, reliable. The kind of man who made difficult things seem simple. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a short message. Friends by chance. Brothers by choice. Winter of 1879. Margaret covered her mouth. Oh my goodness. Elias remained silent. For years he had traveled from town to town, carrying little more than memories. Now one of those memories sat in his hands. Real. Tangible. Waiting for him inside a chair he was never supposed to find. Then Margaret looked at the brass key. What do you think it opens? Elias took the key carefully. It felt heavier than expected. A number had been stamped into the metal. 17. That was all. No name. No address. Just a number. The mystery had grown larger instead of smaller. Before either of them could say more, the diner door opened. Both turned. Mr. Whitaker stepped inside. His polished boots clicked against the floor. He immediately noticed the photograph on the table, then the open compartment beneath the chair. His confident expression disappeared for a fraction of a second. A tiny reaction, but enough. Elias noticed. Margaret noticed too. Whitaker recovered quickly. Interesting day, he asked. Neither answered. His eyes lingered on the brass key. Something cold entered his smile. Some things are better left buried. The room became very quiet. Elias slowly stood. What does that mean? Whitaker adjusted his coat. Just advice. Margaret narrowed her eyes. You know what this is? Whitaker laughed softly. Everybody in this town knows stories about Thomas Hale. That is not what I asked. For the first time, Whitaker seemed uncomfortable. He glanced toward the key again, then toward the photograph, then back at Margaret. You should be careful what questions you start asking. He turned and headed for the door. Before leaving, he paused. 3 weeks, Mrs. Hale. Then he was gone. The bell rang overhead. Silence returned. But now the silence felt different. Dangerous. Curious. Alive. Margaret stared at the closed door. He knows something. Elias looked down at the key resting in his palm. The number 17 gleamed beneath the afternoon sunlight. Yeah. His voice was calm. Determined. I think he does. And for the first time since the hidden letter appeared, both of them realized they were no longer uncovering a memory. They were uncovering a secret somebody in Dry Creek had spent 12 years trying to keep hidden. That evening, neither Elias nor Margaret spoke much. The photograph remained on the counter between them. The brass key rested beside it. Outside, the sun disappeared behind distant hills, leaving Dry Creek wrapped in deep blue shadows. Lanterns flickered to life one by one along Main Street. The town looked peaceful, ordinary, yet both of them knew something had changed. Secrets had a way of doing that. They made familiar places feel unfamiliar. Margaret locked the front door and turned the sign to closed. Then she looked at the key again. Number 17. No name. No explanation. Just a number. There has to be a reason Thomas hid it, she said quietly. Elias nodded. And a reason Whitaker reacted the way he did. Margaret sat across from him. What if the key opens something valuable? Elias considered that. Maybe. Maybe it is money. Maybe it could save the diner. The words escaped before she could stop them. Immediately she looked away. Elias understood. For a moment, this had stopped being about old letters and forgotten promises. Reality had returned. Bills. Debt. Deadlines. 3 weeks. 3 weeks before Whitaker took everything. Margaret folded her hands together. I am sorry. For what? For hoping. Elias looked at her carefully. Nothing wrong with hoping. Margaret laughed softly. That depends how many times hope disappoints you. Silence settled over the room. Elias knew that feeling. He had lived with it for years. The next morning they decided to start with the most obvious question. What did number 17 mean? Dry Creek was not a large town. By noon they had already checked the train depot, the grain warehouse, and the post office. None used numbered keys like the one Thomas had hidden. By mid-afternoon, frustration began to creep in. Elias stood outside the general store, studying the brass key again. Sunlight reflected from its worn surface. The edges were smooth from age. This key had been used often once, then forgotten. Margaret emerged from the store carrying a notebook. Nothing. Elias sighed. Same answer I got. She leaned against the wooden railing. Maybe we are looking in the wrong place. Before he could answer, a voice interrupted them. You two seem busy. They turned. Sheriff Nolan stood beside the boardwalk. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with silver hair and a reputation for noticing things others missed. Margaret forced a smile. Just running errands. The sheriff's eyes moved immediately toward the key. That does not look like an errand. Elias exchanged a glance with Margaret. Then something occurred to him. Sheriff, how long have you been in Dry Creek? Nolan chuckled. Long enough to regret it some days. Do you remember Thomas Hale? The sheriff's smile faded. Of course. Do you know anything about this? Elias held up the key. The sheriff studied it for several seconds. Then his expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. Recognition. Where did you get that? Margaret stepped forward. You know it. Nolan took off his hat. I have not seen one of those in years. Elias felt his pulse quicken. One of those. The sheriff nodded slowly. That is a storage key. Storage where? For a moment Nolan seemed reluctant to answer. Then he pointed toward the edge of town. Beyond the train tracks. Beyond the grain silos. Old Dry Creek Station. Margaret frowned. The abandoned freight depot. Used to be more than that, Nolan said. Back when the railroad first came through, they rented private storage lockers. Every locker had a number. Elias looked at the key. 17. The sheriff nodded. Exactly. Margaret's eyes widened. Does the building still exist? Most of it. And locker 17? Nolan smiled faintly. Only one way to find out. Less than an hour later, Elias and Margaret stood in front of the abandoned depot. The building looked older than memory itself. Weathered boards creaked in the wind. Rust covered the iron tracks nearby. Weeds pushed through cracks in the foundation. The place smelled of dust and forgotten years. Margaret looked uncertain. You really think something is still inside? Elias stared at the key. Thomas hid this for a reason. Together they stepped through the old doorway. Sunlight filtered through broken windows. Rows of storage lockers lined one wall. Most hung open and empty. Others had collapsed completely. Yet near the back of the building, one door remained intact. 17. The faded number was still visible beneath layers of dust. Neither moved at first. The moment felt larger than either expected. 12 years of waiting. Hidden letters. A secret compartment. A photograph. All leading here. Elias inserted the brass key into the lock. It fit perfectly. The mechanism resisted at first. Then came a sharp click. The sound echoed through the empty depot. Margaret held her breath. Slowly, Elias reached for the handle. He pulled the door open. Inside sat a single wooden chest covered in dust. Nothing else. No explanation. No note. Just a chest waiting in the darkness. And nailed to the lid was a small brass plaque carrying 5 words that made both of them freeze where they stood. For the Walker family only. For several seconds neither Elias nor Margaret moved. The words on the brass plaque seemed impossible to ignore. For the Walker family only. Dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight. Somewhere above them, loose boards creaked softly in the wind. The abandoned depot had been silent for years, yet now it felt as though it had been waiting for this exact moment. Elias stared at the wooden chest. His chest tightened. He had spent years wandering from one town to another believing the past was gone forever. Now the past sat less than 3 feet away. Real. Locked. Waiting. Margaret stood beside him with both hands clasped together. You should open it. Elias swallowed. Maybe. Thomas left it for your family. His eyes remained fixed on the chest. That is exactly why I am nervous. Margaret understood. Some answers brought comfort. Others changed everything. Slowly Elias knelt beside the chest. The wood was old but well preserved. Someone had cared enough to protect it from moisture and decay. A second brass key rested inside the lock. Smaller than the first, hidden until now beneath a layer of dust. Elias turned it carefully. The lock clicked open immediately. Neither spoke. The sound echoed through the empty building. Then he lifted the lid. The smell of aged paper and cedar drifted into the air. Inside rested several items arranged neatly. a stack of letters tied with faded ribbon, a leather-bound journal, a small cloth pouch, and beneath everything else, a folded document sealed inside waxed paper. Margaret slowly exhaled. Thomas kept all this here? Elias reached for the letters first. Every envelope carried the same handwriting. Thomas Hales. Most were addressed to Samuel Walker, his father. The sight alone felt overwhelming. He picked up the first letter and carefully unfolded it. The paper had yellowed with age, but the words remained clear. Thomas wrote about ordinary things. Ranch repairs, harsh winters, railroad work. Yet beneath the ordinary details flowed something deeper. Respect, gratitude, friendship. Letter after letter revealed the same truth. Thomas admired Samuel Walker more than anyone else he had ever known. Margaret watched quietly as Elias read. Then he reached a letter unlike the others. The date was different. Written years later, long after the friendship began. Elias opened it carefully. His eyes moved across the page, then stopped. Margaret noticed immediately. What is it? Elias read the passage again to make certain. Then he handed her the letter. Margaret's eyes widened as she read. Thomas described a financial opportunity offered to both men during the early railroad expansion. Samuel had invested his savings. Thomas had done the same. Together, they purchased a small parcel of land near a future rail junction. Neither man expected much from it at the time. Yet years later, the property value increased dramatically. Margaret looked up. Land. Elias nodded slowly. Apparently, they both turned toward the sealed document resting beneath the letters. Suddenly, it seemed far more important than before. Elias carefully removed the waxed paper. Inside lay an official deed bearing several signatures and county seals. He studied the document, then studied it again. The parcel still existed. The ownership had never been transferred. One half belonged to Thomas Hale. The other half belonged to Samuel Walker. Margaret looked stunned. How much would something like that be worth? Elias shook his head. I have no idea. But deep down, he suspected the answer might matter. A lot. Then something else caught his attention. The leather journal. He opened it carefully. Most pages contained Thomas's personal notes, weather records, business accounts, daily observations. Then near the middle, he discovered an entry marked with a single word. Debt. Elias felt his pulse quicken. He began reading aloud. Thomas described the winter of 1879. A terrible storm. Supplies running low. Livestock dying. Men abandoning their properties. During that winter, Samuel Walker had helped save Thomas from financial ruin by lending him money he could not repay. Not because he expected anything in return, simply because it was the right thing to do. Margaret listened silently. Thomas's final sentence filled the room. If I ever prosper because of Samuel's kindness, half of everything I build belongs to his family. Neither spoke after that. The meaning was clear. The chest was never hidden treasure. It was something rarer. A promise kept. A debt remembered. A friendship honored across decades. Then Elias opened the small cloth pouch. Inside rested several gold coins. Not many. Perhaps enough to cover a few months of expenses. Yet beneath the coins sat a folded note. Thomas's handwriting again. Elias unfolded it carefully. His breath caught. Margaret stepped closer. The note contained only one short instruction. If Samuel's family ever returns, tell them to visit the First Territorial Bank in Cheyenne. Ask for Box 214. Everything else is waiting there. Silence filled the depot. Elias stared at the note. Margaret stared at him. The mystery they thought was ending had suddenly become much larger. Somewhere in Cheyenne, nearly 200 miles away, another piece of Thomas Hale's secret remained untouched. Waiting. Protected. Hidden for more than a decade. And for the first time since opening the chest, Elias began to understand why Whitaker looked so nervous when he saw the key. The ride back to Dry Creek felt different. The road had not changed. The rolling hills remained the same. The wind still carried the scent of sagebrush and distant rain. Yet Elias Walker no longer felt like a man wandering without direction. For the first time in years, he carried something more valuable than supplies or money. He carried purpose. Beside him, Margaret rode quietly, holding the journal and letters carefully wrapped in cloth. Neither spoke much. Some discoveries were too large for immediate conversation. By the time they reached town, evening shadows stretched across Main Street. Lanterns glowed behind store windows. The familiar sight of Hale's diner appeared ahead. Home. The word surprised Elias. He had not thought it in years. Inside the diner, Margaret placed the letters on the counter and sat down heavily. The last few days had changed everything. Yet one problem remained exactly where it had always been. The stack of unpaid bills. The notices. The deadline. 3 weeks had become less than 2. Reality was patient. It waited for no mystery to be solved. Elias looked at the papers. Then at Margaret. How much? She already knew what he meant. Enough. That is not an answer. A tired smile crossed her face. It is the answer I prefer. Elias pulled out a chair. How much? Margaret hesitated. Finally, she opened a ledger and turned it toward him. He studied the figures. His expression remained calm, but inside he felt a wave of frustration. The amount was not impossible, yet it was far beyond what either of them could produce quickly, unless the answers waiting in Cheyenne proved valuable. Margaret followed his gaze. Do not do that. Do what? Start thinking this is your responsibility. Elias looked toward the empty chair in the corner. The chair that had started everything. Maybe it is. Margaret shook her head immediately. No. Thomas believed otherwise. Her eyes softened. Thomas believed many things. Silence settled between them. Then the bell above the door rang unexpectedly. Both looked up. Sheriff Nolan stepped inside, carrying a folded newspaper beneath his arm. He removed his hat and approached slowly. Something about his expression seemed unusual. Serious. Thoughtful. Evening, he said. Sheriff, Margaret replied. Nolan placed the newspaper on the counter. You two might want to see this. Elias unfolded the paper. An announcement occupied the front page. A public auction scheduled in less than 2 weeks. Several properties listed. One name immediately stood out. Hale's Diner. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Seeing it in print somehow made everything more real. More final. Nolan leaned against the counter. Whitaker is moving faster than expected. Elias frowned. Why? The sheriff sighed. Because somebody told him you found something. The room became very quiet. Margaret looked up sharply. Who? Nolan shook his head. Small towns do not keep secrets very well. Elias immediately thought of the depot. The key. The chest. The letters. Somehow word had escaped. Nolan lowered his voice. Whatever Thomas left behind, Whitaker is worried about it. Margaret exchanged a glance with Elias. That single sentence confirmed what they had suspected all along. Whitaker knew more than he admitted. Much more. After the sheriff left, darkness settled fully across Dry Creek. One by one, the lights along Main Street disappeared. The diner grew quiet again. Margaret stood near the window watching the empty street. You should go to Cheyenne, she said suddenly. Elias turned. What? She kept looking outside. The bank. The box. The answers. We go. Margaret shook her head. No. Margaret. The diner cannot. Close for several days. She turned to face him. And if what Thomas left belongs to your family, you should be the one to find it. Elias wanted to argue. Instead, he looked at her face. Determined. Stubborn. The same expression she wore every time life tried to push her backward. Finally, he nodded once. All right. Relief mixed with sadness crossed her eyes. Neither of them liked the decision. Yet both knew it was necessary. Later that night, after the diner closed, Elias packed his saddlebag in the boarding house. The trip to Cheyenne would take several days. Long enough for doubts to grow. Long enough for uncertainty to settle in. Before sleeping, he unfolded one final letter from the chest. A letter written by Thomas near the end of his life. Most of it spoke about friendship, loyalty, gratitude. Then Elias reached the final sentence. He read it twice. Then a third time. If you are reading this, it means the road finally brought a walker back to Dry Creek. Trust Margaret Hale. She is the best thing I ever built. Elias stared at those words long after the lantern burned low. And for the first time, leaving Dry Creek felt far more difficult than arriving ever had. The sun had not yet risen when Elias left Dry Creek. The streets were empty except for a single newspaper boy arranging bundles outside the general store. A cold wind swept through town, carrying fallen leaves across the boardwalk. Margaret stood outside the diner wrapped in a wool coat, her hands tucked into her pockets. Neither of them had much to say. Some departures felt heavier when the destination mattered. Elias tightened the saddle on his horse and looked toward her. I will be back. Margaret nodded. I know. He wanted to say more. Something about how different life felt now. Something about how the diner no longer seemed like a place he visited, but a place he belonged. Instead, he simply tipped his hat. Then he rode away. The journey to Cheyenne took nearly 3 days. Long stretches of open prairie rolled endlessly beneath the sky. Ranches appeared and disappeared along the horizon. Freight wagons passed occasionally. At night, he slept beneath the stars, wrapped in blankets and old memories. During those quiet hours, he thought often about Thomas Hale, about Samuel Walker, about the strange chain of kindness connecting men across decades. One act of generosity during a hard winter had survived 12 years after death, maybe longer. By the afternoon of the third day, the skyline of Cheyenne appeared in the distance. Compared to Dry Creek, the city felt enormous. Railroad whistles echoed through crowded streets. Merchants shouted from storefronts. Wagons packed every corner. Elias guided his horse through the noise until he found the First Territorial Bank. The building stood 3 stories tall, built from brick and stone. Respectable, permanent, the kind of place that looked like it trusted nobody. Inside, polished floors reflected sunlight from tall windows. Clerks moved quietly between desks. Elias approached the counter. "Can I help you?" the banker asked. Elias removed the folded note from Thomas Hale. "I need access to Box 214. The banker glanced at the paper. His expression changed immediately. He read it twice, then looked up. One moment. Without another word, he disappeared into a back office. Several minutes passed. Elias waited patiently. Finally, an older gentleman emerged carrying a ring of keys. His gray suit looked expensive. His eyes looked surprised. "Mr. Walker?" Elias nodded. The man extended his hand. "My name is Arthur Bennett. I have been waiting 20 years to meet you." Elias blinked. "What?" Bennett smiled. "Or someone from your family." The banker led him downstairs into the vault. Thick steel doors lined the walls. Rows of deposit boxes stretched in every direction. The air smelled faintly of metal and old paper. Bennett stopped before one particular box. "Number 214. Thomas Hale came here many years ago," he explained. He left instructions that this box remain untouched until claimed by a member of the Walker family. Elias stared at the box. "You kept it that long?" Bennett laughed softly. "Some promises are worth keeping." He unlocked the compartment and stepped away. "Take your time." Then he left. Alone in the vault, Elias carefully opened the box. Inside rested a single leather portfolio. Nothing else. No gold. No jewels. No stacks of money. Just papers. For a moment, he felt almost disappointed. Then he opened the portfolio. His disappointment vanished instantly. Property records. Railroad contracts. Investment certificates. Ownership documents. Dozens of them. Every page carried both names. Thomas Hale and Samuel Walker. Elias read carefully. The railroad land they purchased together had become valuable beyond anything either man could have imagined. Several contracts generated annual payments. Additional investments had grown over decades. Interest had accumulated year after year. Protected. Untouched. Waiting. Elias sat down slowly. The numbers hardly seemed real. He reviewed them again. Then a third time. There was no mistake. The Walker family's share alone was worth enough to change everything. Enough to erase every debt Margaret faced. Enough to save the diner many times over. Enough to provide security for the rest of his life. Yet something else sat at the bottom of the portfolio. A final letter. Elias immediately recognized Thomas Hale's handwriting. He unfolded it carefully. The message was short. Very short. Thomas explained that Samuel Walker had refused repayment many times during his life. Whenever Thomas tried to settle the debt, Samuel simply laughed and changed the subject. So Thomas had chosen a different path. He invested the money instead. He protected it. He grew it. Then he left instructions for the future. The final sentence brought tears to Elias's eyes before he even realized it. If you are reading this, then kindness has finally completed its journey home. Hours later, as the evening train whistles echoed across Cheyenne, Elias stepped back into the sunlight, carrying the portfolio beneath his arm. He should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt grateful. Because for the first time, this was no longer about money. It was about a promise kept across generations. And now he knew exactly where he needed to go next. The ride back to Dry Creek felt shorter than the journey to Cheyenne. Perhaps because Elias no longer carried uncertainty. He carried answers. The leather portfolio rested securely inside his saddlebag. Every mile brought him closer to the place he now realized he did not want to leave. The autumn wind swept across the prairie. Golden grass bent beneath the afternoon sun. Somewhere beyond the hills, smoke from ranch chimneys drifted into the clear sky. For years, Elias Walker had ridden across landscapes just like these without feeling connected to any of them. Now, for the first time in a very long while, he was riding towards someone instead of away from something. By the time Dry Creek appeared on the horizon, evening had begun to settle over the town. Lanterns glowed behind storefront windows. The familiar bell tower stood against the fading sky. Everything looked exactly the same, yet everything felt different. As Elias entered Main Street, he immediately noticed a crowd gathered near the diner. Men and women stood talking quietly. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked curious. Elias felt a knot form in his stomach. He dismounted quickly and made his way forward. Sheriff Nolan spotted him first. Relief crossed the old lawman's face. "You picked a good time to come back." Elias glanced toward the diner. "What happened?" Nolan handed him a folded notice. Elias read it once. Then again. The auction had been moved forward. Tomorrow morning. Less than 12 hours away. Whitaker had found a legal way to accelerate the process. Margaret stood near the diner entrance, speaking with a supplier. She looked exhausted. Yet when she saw Elias, everything else disappeared from her expression. For a moment, neither moved. Then she walked toward him. "You made it back." Elias nodded. "I did." Margaret searched his face. And, without a word, Elias removed the portfolio from his saddlebag and handed it to her. She opened it carefully. Her eyes moved across the documents. The investment records. The ownership certificates. The bank statements. Then she stopped. Tears filled her eyes before she reached the final page. "Elias." He smiled softly. "Thomas kept his promise." Margaret lowered her head. For several seconds, she could not speak. The crowd around them watched quietly, sensing that something important was happening. Sheriff Nolan stepped closer and examined the paperwork. Then his eyebrows rose. "Well, I will be." Word spread quickly, faster than prairie fire carried by dry wind. By sunset, nearly everyone in town knew. Thomas Hale and Samuel Walker had built something together. A fortune born from friendship, trust, and patience. A fortune that had waited years to find its rightful owners. The next morning, the auction proceeded exactly as scheduled. Whitaker arrived wearing the same polished coat and confident smile. He greeted people as though the outcome had already been decided. A small platform had been built outside the diner. Townsfolk gathered beneath the cool morning sky. Margaret stood quietly beside Sheriff Nolan. Elias remained near the back of the crowd. The auctioneer cleared his throat and began reading the formal notice. Then came the moment everyone expected. "Do we have an opening bid?" Before anyone could answer, Elias stepped forward. The crowd parted automatically. Whitaker's smile faded. Elias handed several documents to the auctioneer. The man reviewed them carefully, then reviewed them again. His expression changed completely. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "it appears all outstanding debts associated with this property have been satisfied in full." Silence swept through the crowd. Absolute silence. Whitaker stared in disbelief. The auctioneer continued. "Furthermore, ownership remains with Mrs. Margaret Hale. Therefore, there will be no auction today." The crowd erupted into applause. Some laughed. Others cheered. Several older residents wiped away tears. Whitaker stood motionless. Not angry. Not defeated. Simply stunned. Because after years of believing he could purchase anything he wanted, he had just encountered something money could not buy. Loyalty. Gratitude. A promise kept. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Margaret stood outside the diner holding the old letter from Thomas. The same letter that had started everything. She looked toward the empty chair visible through the front window. Then she walked inside. Elias followed. The morning sun poured through the glass. Dust floated lazily through golden light. The chair waited quietly in its corner. Margaret approached it. For 12 years, she had kept it. Untouched. Reserved. Protected. Waiting for a story to finish. Slowly she picked up the plate. Then the coffee cup. Then the folded napkin. Finally, she removed the small sign hanging from the backrest. Reserved. She looked at it for several seconds. Then smiled. Not a sad smile. Not a lonely one. A peaceful smile. The kind that arrives when waiting finally ends. She walked across the room and placed the sign in front of Elias. "I think this belongs here now." Elias looked at the sign. Then at Margaret. Neither needed to say much. Some moments speak for themselves. Outside, Dry Creek continued its ordinary day. Wagons rolled down Main Street. Merchants opened their shops. Children chased each other beneath the autumn sun. Yet inside the diner, something extraordinary had happened. A promise made decades earlier had finally come home. A friendship had outlived time. A debt had become a blessing. And two lonely people had discovered that sometimes the road does not lead you away from the past. Sometimes it leads you exactly where you belong. Years later, people in Dry Creek still told the story. Not about the money. Not about the hidden documents. Not even about the fortune waiting in Cheyenne. They remembered something much simpler. They remembered a tired cowboy who walked into a nearly forgotten diner and a widow who offered him a bowl of soup when nobody else saw his worth. Because out on the frontier, kindness always travels farther than we imagine. And sooner or later, it finds its way home. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share where you are watching from in the comments. Somewhere out there, another story is already waiting beside the next dusty road.